Hello, this is From Ideology to Unity, a spiritual journey where we let go of ideological doctrine and ego in favor of meaning, purpose, and unity as a whole. So today I'm alone. Well, I just finished recording the last interview, but yeah, so I'm going to be reading from Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle by C.G. Jung. So this is actually one of my favorite books by Carl Jung, and it's fairly short. So in a few parts, I'll be reading this out. So this is the 1987 edition, I think. First published in 1955. Okay, so it's first published in 1955, ARK Edition 1985, reprinted in 1987. And the most recent printing of it was 2008. And that was in 27 Church Road, Hove, East Sussex. It was also in New York, but I don't need to mention that, I don't think. Yeah, so by Routledge. Right, so that's the details. So, okay, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'll read the back of this, the blurb. To Jung, synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence in time, a psychic factor which is independent of space and time. This revolutionary concept of synchronicity both challenges and complements the physicist's classical view of causality. It also forces us to a basic reconsideration of the meaning of change, probability, coincidence, and the singular events in our lives. Jung draws on his world-famous work as a psychiatrist to examine the principle of synchronicity and arrives at far-reaching conclusions as to its nature. He analyzes the psychology of synchronicity, discusses the forerunners of the concept, and studies in detail the effectiveness of astrology in predicting the future. So it's no wonder that David Wilcock refers quite a lot to this, or at least a fair bit to Jung. This makes up part of the body of work for mysticism, even if it wasn't intended as such. And by the time you've got to the end of this, you understand why. I don't think that Jung was a mystic, but I do think that his ideas definitely lend towards that. It's had to do with his investigation of the collective unconscious and archetypes and much more, including synchronicity. This is considered some of his more out there work. A lot of people consider the collective unconscious to be too out there for them. Even though you can interpret it in a materialist way. Okay, so. All right. Well, this is a translator note. I will skip that, but the foreword, perhaps. Yeah, I'll tell you what, you can skip ahead a little bit if you don't want to hear the foreword, but I'm going to read this out. In writing this paper, I have, so to speak, made good a promise which for many years I lacked the courage to fulfill. The difficulties of the problem and its presentation seemed to me too great the intellectual responsibility without which such a subject cannot be tackled, too inadequate in the long run my scientific training. If I have now conquered my hesitation and at last have come to grips with my theme, it is chiefly because my experiences of the phenomenon of synchronicity have multiplied themselves over the decades, while on the other hand, my researches into the history of symbols, and of the fish symbol in particular, brought the problem ever closer to me, And finally, because I've been alluding to the existence of this phenomenon on and off in my writings for 20 years without discussing it any further. I would like to put a temporary end to this unsatisfactory state of affairs by trying to give a consistent account of everything I have to say on this subject. I hope it will not be construed as presumption on my part if I make uncommon demands on the open-mindedness and goodwill of the reader. Not only is he expected to plunge into the regions of human experience which are dark, dubious, and hedged about with prejudice, but the intellectual difficulties are such as the treatment and elucidation of so abstract a subject must inevitably entail. As anyone can see for himself after reading a few pages, there can be no question of a complete description and explanation of these complicated phenomena, but only an attempt to broach the problem in such a way as to reveal some of its manifold aspects and connections, and to open up a very obscure field, which is philosophically of greatest importance. As a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I have often come up against the phenomena in question and would convince myself how much these inner experiences meant to my patients. In most cases, they were things which people do not talk about for fear of exposing themselves to thoughtless ridicule. I was amazed to see how many people had experiences of this kind and how carefully the secret was guarded. So my interest in this problem was a human as well as a scientific foundation. In the performance of my work, I had the support of a number of friends who are mentioned in the text. Here I would like to express my particular thanks to Dr. Lillian Freyron for her help in the astrological material. August 1950, Carl Jung. You know, I had a sense that I was being watched when I was reading that. I don't know why, I just did. Interesting. Chapter 1, exposition. You know, what I say, I mean, sense of being watched. Like, I am recording, maybe it's that, right? Okay. Chapter 1, exposition. The discoveries of modern physics have, as we know, brought about a significant change in our scientific picture of the world, in that they have shattered the absolute validity of natural law and made it relative. Natural laws are statistical truths, which means that they are completely valid only when dealing with macro-physical quantities. In the realm of very small quantities, prediction becomes uncertain, if not impossible, because very small quantities no longer behave in accordance with the known natural laws. Okay, so I'm pretty sure he's alluding to quantum physics here. The philosophical principle that underlies our conception of natural law is causality. But if the connection between cause and effect turns out to be only statistically valid and only relatively true, then the causal principle is only of relative use for explaining natural processes, and therefore presupposes the existence of one or more other factors which would be necessary for an explanation. This is as much as to say that the connection of events may, in certain circumstances, be other than causal, and requires another principle of explanation. The footnote there at the end that says, other than or supplementary to the laws of chance. So, in another episode I've done, I was reading a scientific explanation of the law of one from the Law of One 101 by Carla Rueckert. And one of the things it discussed was the uncertainty principle, about how if you're dealing with quantum phenomena, you can look at the momentum, you can look at the position, you can't look at both, and you interfere with the results by observing. And that fundamentally interferes with causality, which is what he was referring to. And when Causality, the connection between cause and effect, turns out to be only statistically valid and relatively true. The causal principle is only of relatively use for explaining natural processes. And we need to have other factors in our explanation. So it connects up with what he's saying here and what he's investigating. And in fact, he was aware of quantum physics. In fact, he conversed with, I think, Pauli. I don't know how to pronounce the physicist's name, but some of the quantum physicists were aware of mysticism anyway. So anyway, I will continue. We shall naturally look around in vain in the macro-physical world for acausal events, for the simple reason that we cannot imagine events that are connected non-causally and are capable of non-causal explanation. But that does not mean that such events do not exist. Their existence, or at least their possibility, follows logically from the premise of statistical truth. The experimental method of inquiry aims at establishing regular events which can be repeated. Consequently, unique or rare events are ruled out of account. Moreover, the experiment imposes limiting conditions on nature, for its aim is to force her to give answers to questions devised by man. Every answer of nature is therefore more or less influenced by the kind of questions asked, and the result is always a hybrid product. This, the so-called scientific view of the world, footnote at the bottom. Okay, that's just German for the same thing, so I'll skip that. Based on this, can hardly be anything more than a psychologically biased particular view which misses out all those by no means unimportant aspects which cannot be grasped statistically. Now that's a key point, right? Because a lot of, now scientism especially is essentially, I would say, an attempt to explain everything in terms of a quantitative scientific process, right? And I don't think you can do that. And I think that he seems to be aware of it too when he wrote this. But to grasp these unique or rare events at all, we seem to be dependent on equally unique and individual descriptions. This would result in a chaotic collection of curiosities, rather like those old natural history cabinets where one finds, cheek by jowl with fossils and anatomical monsters in bottles, the horn of a unicorn, the mandragora mannequin, and the dried mermaid. The descriptive sciences, and above all biology in the widest sense, are familiar with these unique specimens, and in their case are only one example of an organism, no matter how unbelievable it may be, is needed to establish its existence. At any rate, numerous observers will be able to convince themselves, on the evidence of their own eyes, that such a creature does in fact exist. But where we are dealing with the ephemeral events, which leave no demonstrable traces behind them except fragmentary memories in people's minds, then a single witness no longer suffices. Nor would several witnesses be enough to make a unique event appear absolutely credible. One has only to think of the notorious unreliability of eyewitness accounts. In these circumstances, we are faced with the necessity of finding out whether the apparently unique event is really unique in our recorded experience, or whether the same or similar events are not to be found elsewhere. Here, the consensus omnium plays a very important role psychologically, though empirically it is somewhat doubtful. For only in exceptional cases does the consensus omnium prove to be of value in establishing facts. The empiricist will not leave it out of account, but will do better not to rely on it. Absolutely unique and ephemeral events, whose existence we have no means of either denying or proving, can never be the object of empirical science. Rare events might well be, provided that there was a sufficient number of reliable individual observations. The so-called possibility of such events is of no importance whatsoever For the criterion of what is possible in any age is derived from that age's rationalistic assumptions. There are no absolute natural laws to whose authority one can appeal in support of one's prejudices. The most that one can fairly be demanded is that the number of individual observations shall be as high as possible. If this number, statistically considered, falls within the limits of chance expectation, then it has to be statistically proved that it was a question of chance, but no explanation has thereby been furnished. So here it's discussing essentially the prerequisites for at least a scientific investigation of phenomena, right? And if we are to look at it in that way, it's quite problematic when you're dealing with things that seem to fly in the face of established science, and yet you cannot conclusively prove it. So, but there's still the question of, is there a bias? Is there a materialist bias or a physicalist bias based on the age we live in now? And well, I would say yes. And he at least seems to be considering this. And it's quite a conundrum when it comes to things like, well, synchronicity, but also things like claims about aliens and stuff. And it's no wonder that people are so skeptical when, like, a lot of the time it can't be conclusively proven. But here's the thing, when it can be, it's dismissed anyway. So it often has been anyway, as is the case with Graham Hancock and the like. All right, okay, I'm going to carry on. There has merely been an exception to the rule. When, for instance, the number of symptoms indicating a complex falls below the probable number of disturbances to be expected during the association experiment, there is no justification for assuming that no complex exists. But that did not prevent the reaction disturbances from being regarded earlier as pure chance. Although in biology, especially, we move in a sphere where causal explanations only seem very unsatisfactory, indeed, well nigh impossible, we shall not concern ourselves here with the problems of biology, but rather with the question whether or not whether there may not be some general field where acausal events not only are possible, but are found to be actual facts. Now, there is in our experience an immeasurably wide field whose extent forms, as it were, the counterbalance to the domain of causality. This is the world of chance, where a chance event seems causally unconnected with a coinciding fact. So we shall have to examine the nature and the whole idea of chance a little more closely. Chance, we say, must obviously be susceptible to some causal explanation, and is only called chance or coincidence because its causality has not yet been discovered. Since we have an inveterate conviction of the absolute validity of causal law, we regard this explanation of chance as quite adequate. But if the causal principle is only relatively valid, then it follows that even though in the vast majority of cases an apparent chance series can be causally explained, there must still remain a number of cases which do not show any causal connection. We are therefore faced with the task of sifting events and separating the acausal ones from those that can be causally explained. It stands to reason that the number of causally explained events will far exceed those suspected of acausality, for which a reason a superficial or prejudiced observer may easily overlook the relatively rare acausal phenomena. As soon as we come to deal with the problem of chance, the need for statistical evaluation of the events in question forces itself upon us. It is not possible to sift the empirical material without a criterion of distinction, how are we to recognize acausal combinations of events, since it is obviously impossible to examine all chance happenings for their causality? The answer to this is that acausal events may be expected most readily where, on closer reflection, a causal connection appears to be inconceivable. As an example, I would cite the duplication of cases, which is a phenomenon well known to every doctor. Occasionally, there is a trebling, or even more, so that camera, footnote 4, Paul Camera das Gesetz der Serie, Stuttgart and Berlin, 1919, can speak of a law of series, of which he gives a number of excellent examples. In the majority of such cases, there is not even the remotest possibility of a causal connection between the coinciding events. When, for example, I'm faced with the fact that my tram ticket bears the same number as the theatre ticket, which I buy immediately afterwards, and I received that same evening a telephone call during which the same number is mentioned again as the telephone number, then a causal connection between them seems to me improbable in the extreme, although it is obvious that each event must have its own causality. So he's talking about numerology. And okay, there's two ways of looking at this from a mystical standpoint, potentially. One is that, okay, that there's an acausal principle connecting these things. And the other is, there is a cause, it's just on a more macro holistic scale that is hard to perceive. The third option is that it's a combination of both, which is probably what it is. I know, on the other hand, that chance happenings have a tendency to fall into aperiodic groupings, necessarily so, because otherwise there would be only a periodic or regular arrangement of events, which would by definition exclude chance. Camera holds that though runs or successions of chance events are not subject to the operation of a common cause, i.e. are acausal, they are nevertheless an expression of inertia, the property of persistence. I will note here that there are footnotes here to evidence. And the footnote to persistence, 7, was this. The law of series is an expression of the inertia of the objects involved in its repetitions, open brackets, i.e. production of the series, producing the series, close brackets. The far greater inertia of the complex of objects and forces, open bracket, as compared to that of a single object or force, close bracket, explains the persistence of an identical constellation and the emergence connected therewith of repetitions over long periods of time. The simultaneity of the run of the same thing side by side, he explains as imitation. Here he contradicts himself, for the run of chance has not been removed outside the realm of the explicable, but, as we would expect, remains inside of it and is consequently reducible, if not to a common cause, then at least to several causes. His concepts of seriality, imitation, attraction, and inertia belong to a causality conceived view of the world, and tells us no more than the run of chance corresponds to statistical and mathematical probability. Footnote. The term probability therefore refers to the probability on a chance hypothesis, null hypothesis. This is the sense in which the term is usually used in this paper. Right. Camera's factual material contains nothing but runs of chance whose only law is probability. In other words, there is no apparent reason why he should look behind them for anything else. But for some obscure reason, he does not look behind them for something more than probability warrants, for a law of seriality, which he would like to introduce as a principle. I made a mistake there. For some obscure reason, he does look behind them for something more than probability warrants, for a law of seriality, which he would like to introduce as a principle of coexistence with causality and finality. This tendency, as I have said, is in no way justified by his material. I can only explain this obvious contradiction by supposing that he had a dim but fascinated intuition of an acausal arrangement and combination of events, probably because, like all thoughtful and sensitive natures, he could not escape the peculiar impression which runs of chance usually make on us, and therefore, in accordance with his scientific disposition, took the bold step of postulating an acausal seriality on the basis of empirical material that lay within the limits of probability. Unfortunately, he did not attempt a quantitative evaluation of seriality. Such an undertaking would undoubtedly have thrown up questions that are difficult to answer. The casuistic method serves well enough for the purposes of general orientation, but only quantitative evaluation or the statistical method promises results in dealing with chance. Chance groupings or series seem, at least to our present way of thinking, to be meaningless and to fall as a general rule within the limits of probability. There are, however, incidents whose chancefulness seem open to doubt. To mention but one example out of many, I noted the following on April 1st, 1949. Today is Friday. We have fish for lunch. Somebody happens to mention the custom of making an April fish of someone. That same morning, I make a note of the inscription which read, Est homo totus medius Pisces ab imo. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I have not seen in months, showed me an extremely impressive pictures of fish which she had painted in the meantime. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with fish-like sea monsters in it. On the morning of April 2nd, another patient, who I had not seen in many years, told me a dream in which she stood on the shore of a lake and saw a large fish on that swam straight towards her and landed at her feet. I was at this stage engaged on the study of the fish symbol in history. Only one of the persons mentioned here knew anything about it. The suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, i.e. an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to me to have a certain numinous quality. Footnote. The numinosity of a series of chance happenings grows in proportion to the number of its terms. Unconscious, probably archetypal contents are thereby constellated, which then give rise to the impression that the series has been caused by the contents. Since we cannot conceive of how this could be possible without recourse to positively magical categories, we generally let it go at the bare impression. However, those of us of more mystical perspective aren't so dismissive of such things. And I imagine after he died, he was aware of the mysticism that his work on archetypes and synchronicity suggests is actually valid. So, interestingly, it's linked to the idea of the age of Pisces, which he hasn't mentioned yet, but we're reaching the end of now, pretty much, but we're reaching the end of then too. Here's another interesting thing. Well, it's interesting because Aquarius is an air symbol, isn't it? But it sounds like water. And the fish is coming out of the water into the air. I'm overthinking it, perhaps. Anyway, I'll carry on. In such circumstances, we are inclined to say that cannot be mere chance, without knowing what exactly we are saying. Camera would no doubt have reminded me of his seriality. The strength of an impression, however, proves nothing against the fortuitous coincidence of all these fishes. It is, admittedly, exceedingly odd that the fish theme reoccurs no less than 6 times within 24 hours. But one must remember that fish on Friday is the usual thing, and on April 1st, one might very easily think of April fish. Had I at that time been working on the fish symbol for several months, fishes frequently occur as symbols of the unconscious contents. So there's no possible justification for seeing in this anything but chance grouping. Runs or series which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences must for the present be regarded as fortuitous. Footnote. As a pendant to which I've been said above, I should like to mention that I wrote these lines sitting by the lake. Just as I had finished this sentence, I walked over to the sea wall, and there lay a dead fish, about a foot long, apparently uninjured. No fish had been there the previous evening. Presumably, it can be pulled out of the water by a bird of prey or a cat. The fish was the 7th in the series. Okay, I remember when I read this the first time, when I read this book, like I was like, that really astonished me, because like, think about this, right? So he is literally writing the words, Carl Jung was literally writing the words, runs or series which are composed of quite ordinary occurrences must be, for the present, be regarded as fortuitous. He was talking about the fish symbol and the previous set of synchronicities. And while he was writing that, he walked out, just afterwards, he walked out and he came across that fish. The universe was like, hey, I know you're like not sure about this, but like, the universe has got a sense of humor, because it's like, yeah, here's more fish. Deal with that, Jung. So, yeah. However wide their range may be, they must be ruled out as acausal connections. It is therefore generally assumed that all coincidences are lucky hits and do not require an acausal interpretation. Footnote 13. We find ourselves in something of a quandary when it comes to making up our minds about the phenomenon which Steckel calls the compulsion of the name. What he means by this is sometimes quite grotesque coincidence between a man's name and peculiarities of profession. For instance, Herr Gross, Mr. Grand, suffers from delusions of grandeur. Herr Kleiner, Mr. Small, has an inferiority complex. The Altman sisters marry men 20 years older than themselves. Herr Feist, Mr. Stout, is the food minister. Herr Rosttauchler, Mr. Horse Trader, is a lawyer. Herr Kalberer, Mr. Calver, is an obstetrician. Herr Freud, Joy, champions the pleasure principle. Herr Adler, Eagle, the will to power. Herr Jung, Young, the principle of rebirth. Which says something about Carl Jung as well, doesn't it? Rebirth, cycles, moving into a new cycle, heralding the new cycle, the new ion. Ion being a book he wrote, by the way. And so on. These are the whimsicalities of chance, or the suggestive effects of the name, as Steckel seems to suggest. Or are they meaningful coincidences? This assumption can, and indeed must, be regarded as true so long as the proof is lacking that their incidence exceeds the limits of probability. Should this proof be forthcoming, however, it would prove at the same time that there are genuinely non-causal combinations of events, for whose explanation we would have to postulate a factor inconsummate with causality. We should then have to assume that events in general are related to one another, on the one hand as causal chains, and on the other hand as a kind of meaningful cross connection. Now, David Wilcock talks about the source field as being what connects all of this. And this doesn't seem to be something Jung was aware of, except that he was aware of quantum fields, in the sense he was aware of quantum physics. Here I would like to draw attention to the treatise of Schopenhauer's on the apparent design in the fate of the individual, which originally stood godfather to the views I am now developing. It deals with the simultaneity of the causally unconnected, which we call chance. Schopenhauer identifies the simultaneity by a geographical analogy, where the parallels represent the cross-connection between meridians, which are thought of as causal chains. And I mentioned there that he's got footnotes for all of this. Quote, that both kind of connection exist simultaneously, and the self-same event, although a link in two totally different chains, nevertheless falls into place in both, so that the fate of one individual invariably fits the fate of the other, and each is the hero of his own drama, or simultaneously figuring in a drama foreign to him, that is something that surpasses our powers of comprehension, and can only be conceived as possible by virtue of the most wonderful pre-established harmony. On that note, in another episode I did, where I was reading from Graham Hancock book, The Synchronicity Key, it was talking about people's doing not past life regression, people put under hypnosis and talking about in between lives and the commonality of stories there. And what was talked about was essentially that they recount of trance of planning their lives beforehand, and even planning some events in which they would enter interactions with certain other people in their lives. So, and you might recount in your own lives like events where it must seem like you just knew them. You came across someone, you've never met them before, but you had a sense that you knew them, or you just clicked with them, right? And the friendship happened naturally. And when I consider my closest friends, I think I knew them before this life. One of them I'm not quite so sure about. But even then, yeah, I would say that my closest friends, I'm pretty sure that I've known them before. And it's likely that it's the case with many of us. I can't back them up, obviously, but yeah, anyway. So, in his view, the subject of the great dream of life is but one. The transcendental will, the prima causa, from which all causal chains radiate like meridian lines from the poles, and because of these circular parallels, stand to one another in a meaningful relationship of simultaneity. Schopenhauer believed in the absolute determinism of the natural process, and furthermore, in a first cause. There was nothing to warrant either assumption. The first cause is a philosophical mythologilem, which is only credible when it appears in the form of the old paradox as unity and multiplicity at once. The idea that the simultaneous points in the causal chains or meridians represent meaningful coincidences would only hold water if the first cause really were a unity. Well, I mean, it was, wasn't it? Right? If there is such a thing as a first cause, really. But if it were a multiplicity, which is just as likely, what's the difference really between multiplicity and unity? You might say everything, but you might also say nothing. Because everything in existence, in all its multiplicity, is a whole which is necessarily a unity, is it not? But certainly he's right that scientifically speaking, according to the scientific method, it cannot be backed up in that way. It's just that the truth isn't scientifically provable, or it's hard to scientifically prove. And yet it's still true. And that's the trap that we've been gotten into by this so-called enlightenment, which is anything but. Despite all the benefits, like it's separated out spirituality and a sense of oneness from everyday lives. So it's into the material and the spiritual, and it's kind of divorced each from the other, which I don't think has been entirely helpful. But it suited the Cabal well, because they could have an entirely, they could discredit the mystical. And when the mystical is largely a key that helps people uncover the true nature of reality, they've certainly benefited from retaining that key exclusively to themselves. But if it were multiplicity, which is just as likely, then Schopenhauer's whole explanation collapses, quite apart from the fact, which we have only recently realized, that natural law possesses a merely statistical validity and thus keeps the door open to indeterminism. I don't really agree with Jung here, and I think that Jung changed his mind after his death. I mean, to experience any afterlife at all would probably pretty much prove the interpretation is wrong of what he said there, but yeah. Neither philosophical reflection nor experience can provide any evidence for the regular occurrence of these two kinds of connection, in which the same thing is both subject and object. Schopenhauer, okay, so it cannot be proven scientifically so far at this point, and yet we know really that it's true. We can understand the position that Jung was in here, though, because he was honestly trying to grapple with these things, and yet he was trying to be scientific at the same time. Schopenhauer thought and wrote at the time when causality held sovereign sway as the category a priori, and had therefore to be dragged in to explain meaningful coincidences. But as we have seen, it can do this to some degree of probability only when we have recourse to the other equally arbitrary assumption of the unity of the first cause. It then follows as a necessity that every point on a given meridian stands in a relationship of meaningful coincidence to every other point on the same degree of latitude. This conclusion, however, goes far beyond the bounds of what is empirically possible, for it credits meaningful coincidences which, with occurring so regularly and systematically, that their verification would be either unnecessary or the simplest thing in the world. Schopenhauer's examples carry as much or as little conviction as all the others. Nonetheless, it is to his credit that he saw the problem and understood that there are no facile ad hoc explanations. Since this problem is concerned with the foundations of our epistemology, he derived it in accordance to the general trend of his philosophy from a transcendental premise, from which the will, which creates life and being on all levels, and which modulates each of these levels in such a way that they are not only in harmony with their synchronous parallels, but also prepare and arrange future events in the form of fate or providence. Now, if that doesn't sound like familiar, if you're interested in the law of one and mysticism, I don't know what will, because that sounds very much like mysticism, very much like what the law of one tells us and what mysticism tells us. I think that Schopenhauer was onto it. Like it's just that it wasn't scientific, it wasn't empirical. Like, I just like reading that, right? It just seemed like a description of the law of one on some level, right? I could be reading that in Graham Hancock's book or something, right? In contrast to Schopenhauer's unaccustomed pessimism, this utterance has an almost friendly and optimistic tone, which we would hardly sympathize with today. One of the most problematical and momentous centuries the world has ever known separates us from that still medievalistic age when the philosophicalizing mind believed it could make assumptions beyond what could be empirically proved. And that's why people don't take Schopenhauer seriously these days. Or at least a lot of people don't. That's going to change though. It was an age of large views. We should not cry halt and think that the limits of nature had been reached just where the scientific road builders had come to temporary stop. Thus Schopenhauer, with true philosophical vision, opened up a field for reflection whose peculiar phenomenology he was not equipped to understand, though he outlined it more or less correctly. He recognized that with their omnia and phraseologia, astrology and various intuitive methods of interpreting fate have a common denominator, which he sought to discover by means of transcendental speculation. He recognized equally rightly that it was a problem of principle of the first order, unlike all those before and after him who operated with futile conceptions of some kind of energy transmission, or conveniently dismissed the whole thing as nonsense in order to avoid too difficult a task. I mean, energy transmission, law of attraction, the evidence in Japan with water memory, and these things seem to suggest something more than that. That it's not just futile, and they seem to suggest energy transmission. And the chakras also suggest that, and I've come across evidence of the chakras. So we can understand this in the time it was written. But this is still a valuable piece, like a jigsaw piece in an overall puzzle, the synchronicity principle. And I thought it's helpful to read this out, so I hope you're interested. Okay. Welcome. Schopenhauer's attempt is the more remarkable in that it was made at a time when the tremendous advance of the natural sciences had convinced everybody that the causality alone could be considered the final principle of explanation. Instead of ignoring all those experiences which refused to bow down to the sovereign rule of causality, he tried, as we've seen, to fit them into his deterministic view of the world. In doing so, he forced concepts like prefiguration, correspondence, and pre-established harmony, which, as a universal order coexisting with the causal one, have always underlain man's explanations of nature, into the causal scheme, probably because he felt, and rightly, that the scientific view of the world, based on natural law, though he did not doubt its validity, nevertheless lacked something which played a considerable role in the classical and medieval view, as it also does in the intuitive feelings of modern man. And a footnote here is, here I must make the exception of Kant, whose treatise Dreams of a Spirit Seer, illustrated by the dreams of metaphysics, pointed the way to Schopenhauer. I might pronounce them wrong, but it doesn't matter. Not to me anyway. The mass of facts collected by Gurney, Myers, and Podmore inspired three other investigators, Dariex, Richet, and Flammarion, to tackle the problem in terms of probability calculus. Dariex found probability of 1 to 4,114,545 for telepathic precognitions of death, which meant that the explanation of such a warning as due to chance is more than 4 million times more improbable than explaining it as telepathic or acausal, meaning coincidence. The astronomer Flammarion reckoned a probability of no less than 1 to 804,622,222 for a particularly well-observed instance of phantasms of the living. He was also the first to link up other suspicious happenings with the general interest in phenomena connected with death. Thus, he relates that while writing his book on the atmosphere, he was just at the chapter of wind force when a sudden gust of wind swept all his papers off the table and blew them out of the window. I mean, synchronicity, right? He also cites an example of triple coincidence, the edifying story, as an example of triple coincidences, the edifying story of Minstrel de Fortgibu and the plum pudding. So that story, so a footnote, is this. A certain M. Deschamps, when a boy in Orleans, was once given a piece of plum pudding by a M. de Fortgibu. 10 years later, he discovered another plum pudding in a Paris restaurant, and asked if he could have a piece. It turned out, however, that the plum pudding was already ordered by M.D. Fortgibu. Many years afterwards, M. Deschamps was invited to partake of our plum pudding as a special rarity. While he was eating it, he remarked that the only thing lacking was M.D. Fortgibu. At that moment, the door opened and an old man in the last stages of disorientation walked in. M.D. Fortgibu, who had got hold of the wrong address and burst in on the party by mistake. Checkmate, atheist. No. Right, I understand. Power memes, eh? Right. The fact that he mentions these coincidences at all is in connection with the problem of telepathy shows that Flammarion had a distinct intuition, albeit an unconscious one, of a far more comprehensive principle. The writer Wilhelm von Scholz, I am excellent at pronouncing German names, as you can tell, has collected a number of stories showing the strange ways in which lost or stolen objects come back to their owners. Among other things, he tells the story of a mother who took a photograph of her small son in the Black Forest. She left the film to be developed in Strasbourg, but owing to the outbreak of war, she was unable to fetch it and gave it up for lost. In 1916, she bought a film in Frankfurt, but in order to take a photograph of her daughter, who had been born in the meantime. When the film was developed, it was found to be doubly exposed. The picture underneath was the photograph she had taken of her son in 1914. The old film had not been developed and had somehow got into circulation again among the new films. The author comes to an understandable conclusion that everything points to a mutual attraction of related objects, or an elective affinity. He suspects these happenings are arranged as if they were the dream of a greater or more comprehensive consciousness that is unknowable. So, that might remind you of Acausal thought on H.P. Lovecraft, but also the idea of a fractal dream that is the holographic universe. The problem of chance has been approached from a psychological angle by Herbert Silberer. He shows that the apparent meaning... There's a footnote there. No, never mind that. He shows the apparent meaningful coincidences are partly unconscious arrangements and partly unconscious arbitrary interpretations. He takes no account either of parapsychic phenomena or of synchronicity, and theoretically, he does not go much beyond the causalism of Schopenhauer. Apart from its valuable psychological criticism of our methods of evaluating chance, Silberer's study contains no reference to the occurrence of meaningful coincidences as here understood. Decisive evidence for the existence of acausal combinations of events has been furnished with adequate scientific safeguards only very recently, mainly through the experiments of J.B. Rhine and his fellow workers. So the footnote is J.B. Rhine, Extrasensory Perception, Boston, 1934, and New Frontiers of the Mind, New York, 1937. J.G. Pratt, J.B. Rhine, C.E. Stewart, B.M. Smith, and J.A. Greenwood. Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, New York, 1940. A general survey of the findings in Rhine, The Reach of the Mind, London and New York, 1948, in Penguin Books, 1954. And also in the valuable book by J.N.M. Tyrrell, The Personality of Man, Penguin Books, London, 1947. A short resume in Rhine, an introduction to the work of extrasensory perception, Transactions of the New York Academy of Sciences, Series 2, 7, 1950. All right, if you could actually put up with that potentially tedious explanation. What I gave you there is the actual evidence, the actual footnotes I've referenced, basically, and giving you a reference. Because you may well be inclined to agree with what I'm painting, the picture I'm painting here. But what's particularly useful about this book is the evidence. This is actual empirical evidence for mysticism, even if that wasn't the intent of Carl Jung. And thus, I feel that it's important to actually go through that evidence. And I feel like it's particularly valuable, especially given that it's extrasensory perception that this deals with. Who have not, however, recognized the far-reaching conclusions that must be drawn from their findings. Up to the present, no critical argument that cannot be refuted has been brought up against these experiments. The experiment consists, in principle, in an experimenter turning up, one after another, a series of numbered cards bearing simple geometrical patterns. At the same time, the subject, separated by a screen from the experimenter, is given the task of guessing the signs as they are turned up. A pack of 25 cards is used, each 5 of which carry the same sign. 5 cards are marked with a star, 5 with a square, 5 with a circle, 5 with wavy lines, and 5 with a cross. The experimenter naturally does not know the order in which the pack is arranged, nor has the subject any opportunity of seeing the cards. Many of the experiments were negative, since the result did not exceed the probability of 5 chance hits. In the case of certain subjects, however, some results were distinctively above probability. The first series of experiments consisted in each subject trying to guess the cards 800 times. The average result showed 6.5 hits for 25 cards, which is 1.5 more than the chance of probability of 5 hits. The probability of there being a chance deviation of 1.5 from the number 5 works out at 1 in 250,000. This proportion shows that the probability of a chance deviation is not exactly high, since it is to be expected only 1 in 250,000 cases. The results vary according to the specific gift of these individual subjects. One young man who in numerous experiments scored an average of 10 hits for every 25 cards, double the probable number, once guessed all 25 cards correctly, which gives a probability of 1. That's a very long number. I'm sure I pronounced that. 1 to 298, 023, 223, 876, 953, 125. I don't even know what number that is. That's just huge, right? The possibility of the pack being shuffled in some arbitrary way is guarded against by the apparatus which shuffles the cards automatically, independently of the experimenter. After the first series of experiments, the spatial distance between the experimenter and the subject was increased, in one case up to 250 miles. The average result of numerous experiments amounted to 10.1 hits for 25 cards. In another series of experiments, when the experimenter and subject were in the same room, the score was 11.4 for 25. When the subject was in the next room, 9.7 for 25. When 2 rooms away, 12 for 25. Ryan mentions the experiments of F.L. Usher and E.L. Burt, which were conducted with positive results over a distance of 960 miles. With the aid of synchronized watches, experiments were also conducted between Durham, North Carolina, and Zagreb, Yugoslavia, about 4,000 miles, with equally positive results. And the reference here is Ryan and Betty M. Humphrey, a transoceanic ESP experiment, the Journal of Parapsychology, Durham, 6, 1942. The fact that distance has no effect in principle shows that the thing in question cannot be a phenomenon of force or energy, for otherwise the distance to be overcome and the diffusion in space would cause a diminution of the effect. Or at least I would say that it cannot be 3D locality. It can be non-locality, which would essentially be, at the very least, 5D. Cannot be a phenomenon of force or energy, but otherwise the distance to be overcome and the diffusion in space would cause a diminution of the effect, and it is more than probable that the score would fall proportionally to the square of the distance. Since this is obviously not the case, we have no alternative but to assume that distance is psychically variable and may, in certain circumstances, be reduced to the vanishing point by a psychic condition. So there are psychic factors at play, irrespective of distance, that determine it, of distance. Yeah. Even more remarkable is the fact that time is not in principle a prohibiting factor either. That is to say, the reading of a series of cards to be turned up in the future produces a score that exceeds chance probability. The results of Ryan's time experiment show a probability of 1 in 400,000, which means a considerable probability of there being some factor independent of time. They point, in other words, to a psychic relativity of time, since the experiment was concerned with perceptions of events which had not yet occurred. In these circumstances, the time factor seems to have been eliminated by a psychic function or psychic condition, which is also capable of abolishing the spatial factor. So mind that's non-local, it's mental, it's non-local, and it's non-temporal, right? All these two things simultaneously. So the mind transcends time and space. This proves it, right? I am no mainstream scientist, I will disagree, but so that's fascinating. I mean, it seems to fit in right in with the law of one, and right in to the raw material, right in with the David Will. One blank for something like that. Not Hancock. I was thinking Hancock. Anyway, the synchronicity key, that author. it fits right in with that when he talks about the afterlife. And if you haven't seen that episode I've done where I do a reading of the afterlife, I encourage you to do so. And if you do that and watch this as well, obviously it will fit together the puzzle pieces a bit better. They point, in other words, to psychic relativity of time, since the experiment was concerned with perceptions of events which had not yet occurred. In these circumstances, the time factor seems to be eliminated by a psychic factor or psychic condition, which is also capable of abolishing the spatial factor. If, in the spatial experiments, we were obliged to admit that energy does not decrease with distance, then the time experiments make it completely impossible for us to even think of there being any energy relationship between the perception and the future event, unless it's a 5D or more a relationship that's non-local. We must give up at the outset all explanations in terms of energy, which amounts to saying that events of this kind cannot be considered from the point of view of causality. Well, I'm not sure about that, because the energy can be interacting non-locally. But on the other hand, it also favors mysticism if energy is not involved. Because we must give up at the outset all explanations in terms of energy, which amounts to saying that events of this kind cannot be considered from the point of view of causality. For causality presupposes the existence of space and time insofar as all observations are ultimately based upon bodies in motion. It would certainly challenge the classical notion of causality, classical science notion of causality. Among Rhine's experiments, we must also mention the experiments with dice. The subject has the task of throwing the dice, which is done by an apparatus, and at the same time, which he has to wish that one number, say 3, will turn up as many times as possible. The results of this so-called PK psychokinetic experiment were positive. The more dice were used at one time. If space and time proved to be psychically relative, then the moving body must possess or be subject to a corresponding relativity. One consistent experience in all these experiments is the fact that the number of hits scored tends to sink after the first attempt, and the results then become negative. But if for some internal or outer reason there is a freshening of interest on the subject's part, the score rises again. Seems to indicate to me positive emotions. I mean, I know that's kind of a label on a judgment to call it positive emotions, but emotions higher up on the frequency scale, such as peace, love, joy, and particularly interest, just mere interest, but the higher the frequency, I would suppose, the more psychokinetic capabilities are able to achieve. I think that makes sense and fits in with this here. Okay. Lack of interest and boredom are negative factors. Enthusiasm, positive expectation, hope, and belief in the possibility of ESP make for good results and seem to be the real conditions which determine whether there are going to be any results at all. I mean, this fits right in with mentalism. And if you see the episode I did, if you listen to the episode I did with, this episode I did with Simon Relling. There's also the episode I did with David Karasek. Those episodes deal with mentalism, the way we can affect reality, and others to some extent. So, and this fits in the law of one, absolutely. And fits in with the water experiment in Japan, where emotional frequency is where it affects things. And I would also mention that the episode I did with that technology, that scanner, that works over a distance. I can't remember what it's called right now, but something drops, matrix drops. Yeah, it's to do with matrix drops, that Hungarian company. Anyway. Okay. In this connection, it is interesting to note that the well-known English medium, Mrs. Eileen J. Garrett, achieved bad results in the Rhine experiments because, as she herself admits, she was unable to sum up any feeling for the soulless test cards. And that's interesting. I imagine that if they weren't soulless to her, subjectively, then she would have been able to achieve good results with that. These few hints may suffice to give the reader an at least superficial idea of these experiments. The above-mentioned book by G.N.M. Tyrrell, late president of the Society of Psychical Research, contains an excellent summing up of all experiences in this field. Its author himself rendered great service to ESP research. From the physicist side to the ESP experiments we have evaluated in a positive sense by Robert A. McConnell in an article entitled ESP Fact or Fancy. Also, we've got a footnote here. Professor Pauly, this is the quantum physics professor, a well-known quantum physicist, Professor Pauly was kind enough to draw my attention to this paper, which appeared in the Scientific Monthly, London, in 1949. Yeah. And this certainly links in with quantum physics, which is itself links into the source field, which also links in with this, and the law of one. As is only to be expected, every conceivable kind of attempt has been made to explain away these results, which seems to border on the miraculous and frankly impossible. But all such attempts to grief on the facts, and the facts refuse. All such attempts come to grief on the facts, and the facts refuse so far to be argued out of existence. Now, since then, mainstream science has, at least if you look on the Wikipedia page, for example, I mean, it absolutely trashes it. I wouldn't say successfully, but it's quite dismissive of it. The mainstream science has been quite dismissive of it since this was written. Anyway. And the facts refuse to be argued out of existence. Rhine's experiments confront us with the fact that there are events which are related to one another experimentally, and in this case, meaningfully, without there being any possibility of proving that this relation is a causal one, since the transmission exhibits none of the known properties of energy, or at least known 3D local properties of energy. There is therefore no good reason to doubt whether it is a question of transmission at all. The time experiments rule out any such thing in principle, for it would be absurd to suppose that a situation that does not yet exist and will only occur in the future could transmit itself as a phenomenon of energy to receive it in the present. Oh, really, Jung? Okay. What if every moment is the present? What if time is simply a fabric that can be rewoven? It seems more likely that a scientific explanation will have to begin with a criticism of our concepts of space and time on one hand, and with the unconscious on the other. As I have said, it is impossible with our present resources to explain ESP or the fact of meaningful coincidence as a phenomenon of energy, which makes an end of the causal explanation as well, for the effect cannot be understood as anything except a phenomenon of energy. Therefore, it cannot be a question of cause and effect, but of a falling together in time, a kind of simultaneity, all points in time being linked. Right? Because of this quality of simultaneity, I have picked up on the term synchronicity to designate a hypothetical factor. And as a footnote, half of the page, Camera has dealt not altogether convincingly with the question of the counter effect of the succeeding state on the preceding one. Right. Equal in rank. To designate a hypothetical factor equal in rank to causality as a principle of explanation. In my essay, The Spirit of Psychology, I define synchronicity as a psychically conditioned relativity of space and time. Rhine's experiments show, in relation to the psyche, space and time are, so to speak, elastic, and can apparently be reduced almost to a vanishing point, as though they were dependent on psychic conditions and did not exist in themselves, but were only postulated by the conscious mind. Law of attraction, anyone? In man's original view of the world, as we find it among primitives, interesting language, but he was writing in a certain time, space and time have a very precarious existence. They become fixed concepts only in the course of his mental development, thanks largely to the introduction of measurement. In themselves, space and time consist of nothing. They are hypostatized concepts born of the discriminating activity of the conscious mind, and they form the indispensable coordinates for describing the behavior of bodies in motion. They are, therefore, essentially psychic in origin, which is probably the reason that impelled Kant to regard them as a priori categories. But if space and time are only apparently properties of bodies in motion and are created by the intellectual needs of the observer, then the relativization of the psychic conditions is no longer a matter for astonishment, but is brought within the bounds of possibility. And this especially links in with quantum physics. And also with space and time being linked, which is something that even Einstein talked about. This possibility presents itself when the psyche observes not external bodies, but itself. That is precisely what happens in Rhine's experiments. The subject's answer is not the result of observing the physical cards, but is the product of pure imagination, of chance ideas which reveal the structure of that which produces them. It's interesting. Observation of oneself. If all is united, if all is one, then all psychic phenomena can be observation of oneself, since we are all one self, right? The structure which produces them, namely the unconscious, or perhaps the conscious. Here I will only point out that it is the decisive factors in the unconscious psyche, the archetypes, which constitute the structure of the collective unconscious. The latter represents a psyche that is identical with itself in all individuals. It cannot be directly perceived or represented, in contrast to the perceptible psychic phenomena, and on account of its irrepresentable nature, I have called it psychoid. The archetypes are formal factors responsible for the organization of unconscious psychic processes, and they are patterns of behavior. At the same time, they have a specific charge and develop numinous effects which express themselves as affects, that's with an A. The affect produces a partial abaissement du niveau mental. For although it raises a particular content to the super, I don't know what that means, abasement du niveau mental, well, I'll have to leave that out. Okay, for although it raises particular content to a supernormal degree of luminosity, it does not it does so by withdrawing so much energy from other possible contents of consciousness that it becomes darkened and eventually unconscious. Owing to the restriction of consciousness produced by the effect so long as it lasts, there is a corresponding lowering of orientation, which in turn gives the unconscious a favorable opportunity to slip into the space vacated. Thus, we regularly find that unexpected or otherwise inhibited unconscious contents break through and find expression in the effect. Such contents are often of an inferior or primitive nature and thus betray their archetypal origin. As I shall show further on, certain phenomena of simultaneity or synchronicity seem to be bound up with the archetypes. So these archetypes in the collective unconscious, if you're not aware, well, I'm sure you can explain it better than me in the book, but it's like, so there's these stories across many cultures. There are the hero's journey. There's the trickster. There's, not the hero is one of them. There's the wise old woman, the wise man, and then the others. And in fact, in pop culture, in different forms, you get archetypes, or at least four different aspects which are named differently, like for example the paladin and so forth, like in D&D and stuff, like, and these often are created, you know, we often see these archetypes, these character formats, I suppose you could say, but some of them are not characters, some of them are elemental, like fire and water and stuff like that, and nature. There are archetypes, and they are conceptualized with commonality across the world independently. And that's something that Jung investigated a lot, and he called it the collective unconscious. So there's the personal unconscious, which is your subconscious or your shadow in the typical sense, which is, well, you've got your conscious side, and then you've got the stuff that you don't accept about yourself. That's, and a lot of our mind is actually subconscious a lot of the time. That's a personal subconscious. The collective unconscious is across all society, across all societies. And there are these formats, like certain characters that, or certain types of characters that pop up, like, and sometimes, according to Jung, the archetype can actually possess us, or we can attribute, or it can have a hold of us in such a way that we show the attributes of that archetype in a way that goes beyond our regular personality. And he called that possession, but he didn't view it in a supernatural way. How the collective unconscious works in a truly, in terms of the law of one, I'm not sure. Anyway, so that's the context. The extraordinary spatial orientation of animals may also point to the psychic relativity of space and time. The puzzling time orientation. Actually, I want to check how much left of this chapter, because at a certain point, I might want to actually skip to another, end this episode. Well, I'm going to keep going until I decide to stop, I guess. All right. I didn't really take note of when I started, to be honest. Okay. Where was I? Okay. The archetypes are formal factors responsible for the organization of unconscious psychic processes. They are patterns of behavior. At the same time, they are, oh, I mentioned that already. The extraordinary spatial orientation of animals may point to the psychic relativity of space and time. The puzzling time orientation of the palolo worm, for instance, whose tail segments, loaded with sexual products, always appear on the surface of the sea the day before the last quarter of the moon in October and November, might be mentioned in this connection. One of the causes suggested is the acceleration of the Earth owing to gravitational pull of the moon at this time. But for astronomical reasons, this explanation cannot possibly be right. So there's two footnotes here. One of them says, to be more accurate, the swarming begins a little before and ends a little after this day, when the swarming is at its height. The months vary according to location. The palolo worm, or waro, of the Aberinina is said to appear at full moon in March. One of the causes suggests, but the relation which undoubtedly exists between human menstruation period and the course of the moon is connected with the latter only numerically and does not really coincide with it, nor has it been proved that it ever did. The problem of synchronicity has puzzled me for a long time, ever since the mid-20s, when I was investigating the phenomena of the collective unconscious. And the footnote here says, even before that time, certain doubts had arisen in me as to the unlimited applicability of the causal principle in psychology. In the foreword to the first edition of the Collected Papers on Analytical Psychology, C.E. Long, London, 1916, I had written, causality is only one principle, and psychology essentially cannot be exhausted by causal methods only, because the mind, psyche, lives by aims as well. Psychic finality rests on a pre-existent meaning, which only becomes problematical when it is an unconscious arrangement. In that case, we have to suppose a knowledge prior to all consciousness, or at least in incarnation, right? Hans Dreist comes to the same conclusion. All right. Investigating phenomena of the collective unconscious, and kept on coming across connections which I simply could not explain as chance groupings or runs, which I found were coincidences which were connected so meaningfully that their chance concurrence would be incredible. By way of example, I shall mention an incident from my own observation. A young woman I was treating had, at a critical moment, a dream in which she was given a golden scarab. While she was telling me this dream, I sat with my back to the closed window. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. It was a gentle tapping. I turned round and saw a flying insect knocking against the window pane from the outside. I opened the window and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was the nearest analogy to a golden scarab that one finds in our latitudes. A scarabaeid beetle, the common rose chafer, Zetonia aurata, which, contrary to its usual habits, had evidently felt the urge to get into a dark room at that particular moment. I must admit that nothing like this has ever happened to me before or since, and that the dream of the patient has remained unique in my experience. I should like to mention another case that is typical of a certain category of events. The wife of my patient, a man in his 50s, once told me in conversation that the deaths of a mother and grandmother, at the deaths of a mother and grandmother, a number of birds gathered outside the windows of the death chamber. I had heard similar stories from other people. When her husband's treatment was nearing her end, his neurosis having been removed, he developed some apparently quite innocuous symptoms, which seemed to me, however, to be those of heart disease. I sent him along to a specialist who, after examining him, told me in writing that he could find no cause for anxiety. On the way back from this consultation with the medical report in his pocket, my patient collapsed in the street. As he was brought home dying, the wife was already in a great state of anxiety because soon after her husband had gone to the doctor, a whole flock of birds alighted on their house. She naturally remembered the similar incidents that had happened at the death of her own relatives and feared the worst. Although I was personally acquainted with the people concerned and know very well that the facts here reported are true, I do not imagine for a moment that this would induce anyone who is determined to regard such things as pure chance to change his mind. My sole object in relating these two incidents is simply to give some indication of how meaningful coincidences usually present themselves in practical life. The meaningful connection is obvious enough in the first case in view of the approximate nature of the chief objects, the scarab and the beetle. But in the second case, the death and the flock of birds seem to be inconmensurable with one another. If one considers, however, that in the Babylonian Hades, the souls wore a feather dress, that in the ancient Egypt, the Ba, or soul, was thought of as a bird, it is not too far-fetched to suppose that there may be some archetypal symbolism at work. Had such incident occurred in the dream, the interpretation would be justified as the comparative psychological material. There seems to be an archetypal foundation to the first cause. It was an extraordinarily difficult case to treat, and up to the time of the dream. Also, there's a footnote here saying, in Homer, the souls of the dead twitter. Interesting. And up to the time of the dream, little or no progress had been made. I should explain that the main reason for my patient's animus, which was steeped in Cartesian philosophy and clung so rigidly to its own idea of reality, the effects of the three doctors, the efforts of the three doctors, I was the third, had not been able to weaken it. Evidently, something quite irrational was needed which was beyond my powers to produce. The animus being, I'm not going to go into that now. But when the scarab came flying through the window, in actual fact, her natural being could burst through the armor of her animus possession, and the process of transformation could at least begin to move. Okay, so animus is the male part of the subconscious in a woman. And the anima is the female part of the subconscious in a man, essentially. Burst through the armor of our animus possession in the process of transformation could at last begin to move. Any essential change of attitude signifies a psychic renewal, which is accompanied by symbols of rebirth and in the patient's dreams and fantasies. The scarab is a classic example of the rebirth symbol. The ancient Egyptian book of what is in the netherworld describes how the dead sun god changes himself into the 10th station of Kebri, the scarab, and then at the 12th station mounts the barge that carries the rejuvenated sun god into the morning sky. The only difficulty here is that with educated people, cryptonesia often cannot be ruled out with certainty, although my patient did not happen to know this symbol. But this does not alter the fact that the psychologist is continually coming up against cases where the emergence of these symbolic parallels cannot be explained without the hypothesis of the collective unconscious. Footnote here, and naturally there can only be These can only be verified when the doctor himself has a necessary knowledge of symbology. How many pages here? Meaningful coincidences, which are to be distinguished from meaningless chance groupings. Therefore, okay, I have another footnote here. Statistical analysis is designed to separate out groupings termed dispersions due to random activity from significant dispersions, in which cases may be looked for. On Professor Jung's hypothesis, however, dispersions due to chance can be subdivided into meaningful, and meaningless. The meaningful dispersions due to chance are made meaningful by the activation of the psychoid archetype. Therefore, seem to rest in the archetypal foundation. At least all cases in my experience, and there is a large number of them, show this characteristic. What that means, I have already suggested above. Although anyone with any experience in this field can easily recognize their archetypal character, you will find it difficult to link them up in the psychic conditions in the Rhine with the psychic conditions in the Rhine experiments, because the latter contains no direct evidence for any constellation of the archetype, nor is the emotional situation the same as in my examples. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that with Rhine, the first series of experiments generally produced the best results, which quickly fell off. But when it was possible to arouse a new interest in the essentially rather boring experiment, the results improved again. It follows that from this that the emotional factor plays an important role. Effectivity, however, rests to the large extent on instincts, whose formal aspect is the archetype. Okay, now I could go on, but I have been going on at length here. So I will leave this episode here for now, and perhaps you can listen to the next episode about where I read out synchronicity. So I have actually got maybe a quarter of the way through the book, actually, or a fifth. So it's not that long. Yeah, I hope you found that interesting. I certainly did. Yeah, bye for now.